Two women share the same face, the same laugh, the same small scar above their left eyebrow from a childhood fall neither of them can remember. One of them signs contracts worth 9 figures from the 40th floor of a glass tower in Chicago. The other irons that woman's blouses and turns down her bed sheets every night, 5 floors below, in a staff apartment she's never once questioned. They have met almost daily for 3 years. Neither has recognized the other's face as her own, because grief has a way of making people stop looking too closely at anything that resembles what they lost. If a story about family, identity, and the quiet weight of not knowing who you are speaks to you, tap like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people, and we read every single one. Eleanor Ford and Josephine Marsh were born 11 minutes apart on a March morning in a small hospital outside Cleveland, to a 19-year-old mother named Carol Ashby who had no husband, no savings, and a landlord already threatening eviction before either baby came home. Carol held both girls exactly once, on the second night, before a hospital social worker sat beside her bed and explained, gently but plainly, that placing both infants together with one adoptive family was proving impossible. There was a couple in Chicago, wealthy and eager, who wanted a daughter but could only take one child. There was a second, quieter family in rural Ohio willing to take the other. Carol was told this was the fastest way to guarantee both girls a stable home. She was 24 hours postpartum, exhausted past the point of clear thought, and she signed the papers because every person in the room who sounded certain told her it was the right thing to do. She never saw either daughter again. She died 8 years later of a heart condition no one had caught in time, having spent every one of those 8 years trying, and failing, to reverse a decision made in a hospital bed by a girl who hadn't yet turned 20. Eleanor went to Chicago, to Richard and Diane Ford, who renamed her, raised her in a house with a lake view, sent her to a private academy, and gave her a childhood built entirely around achievement. Richard ran an investment firm, Diane sat on museum boards. They loved Eleanor in the specific way people love a project they're proud of, which is not the same as unconditional, but Eleanor didn't know that yet, because she'd never had anything to compare it to. She was told, at age 6, that she was adopted, and given no other information beyond that, because Diane believed, sincerely, if wrongly, that curiosity about a birth family was a kind of disloyalty. Eleanor learned not to ask. Josephine went to a modest farmhouse outside Millersburg, to a couple named Frank and Sue Marsh, who already had 2 boys and took Josephine in less because they'd planned for a 3rd child and more because Sue's sister worked at the agency and called crying about a baby who needed a home immediately. The Marshes were kind, tired, unglamorous people who raised Josephine on a diet of chores, church on Sundays, and the specific affection of a family with no money but no shortage of hands to hold. Josephine grew up believing, correctly, that she was loved, and believing, incorrectly, that she had no other family anywhere in the world worth wondering about. Frank and Sue told her she was adopted when she turned 12. They didn't have a twin sister's name to give her, because Carol's hospital records had been sealed on both sides, deliberately, at the request of the Ford's attorney, who wanted no possibility of the 2 adoptive families ever finding each other. For 26 years, the 2 women lived 400 miles apart and never once crossed paths, until the year both of their lives quietly rearranged themselves and put them in the same building. Eleanor Ford became, by 30, the CEO of Halden Grove Capital, a private investment firm her adoptive father had built and handed to her not out of sentiment but because she had earned it, 9 years of 80-hour weeks, an MBA she'd finished a year early, and a reputation for reading a balance sheet the way other people read weather. She was known in Chicago's finance circles as precise, formal, and almost entirely unknowable outside a boardroom. She lived in the penthouse of a building the firm owned, on the 40th floor, alone except for the housekeeping staff who kept the apartment running, because Eleanor had learned early that intimacy was inefficient and had simply stopped budgeting time for it. Josephine Marsh, meanwhile, had spent her 20s failing at things she loved and succeeding at things she didn't particularly want. She'd studied nursing for 2 years before her father's stroke pulled her home to help care for him, and by the time he recovered enough that she could leave again, the tuition money was gone and so was most of her confidence. She worked hotel housekeeping in Columbus for 4 years, then took a position with a private domestic staffing agency because it paid better, and the agency placed her, without much ceremony, in a live-in housekeeping role for a private residence in Chicago, the 40th floor penthouse of Halden Grove Capital CEO. Josephine met Eleanor for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in a hallway, both of them tired, neither of them looking directly at the other's face, and Eleanor said, "You must be the new housekeeper." "Marsh, is it?" and Josephine said, "Yes, ma'am," and that was the entire encounter. Eleanor did not recognize her own bone structure staring back at her because she wasn't looking for it. She had no framework in which a member of her cleaning staff could be family, and the brain, faced with an impossible category, simply doesn't sort information into it. Josephine, for her part, had spent her whole life being told she resembled no one in her family, and had long ago stopped noticing faces for traces of her own, because it had only ever led to disappointment. For 3 years, this continued. Josephine ironed Eleanor's blouses, restocked her kitchen, kept the penthouse running with a competence Eleanor genuinely valued and rarely acknowledged out loud, because Eleanor had built a professional persona in which warmth toward staff felt, to her, like a weakness she couldn't afford to display. She wasn't cruel. She was distant in the specific way of someone who had learned as a child that closeness was a resource to be rationed. She paid Josephine well, on time, and never once asked her a personal question beyond scheduling logistics. Josephine, in turn, kept a professional distance of her own, partly out of habit and partly because something about Eleanor's face, on the rare occasions she let herself study it, made her feel a loneliness she couldn't name and didn't examine. The thing that finally broke the pattern was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a filing cabinet. Diane Ford died in the autumn of Eleanor's 33rd year, 3 years after Richard had passed, and Eleanor, the only child, the only heir, the only person left to close out a life, spent a weekend at the Ford Lake house sorting through decades of paperwork her mother had never let anyone else touch. In a locked drawer in Diane's study, behind a folder of museum correspondence, Eleanor found a sealed envelope from an adoption attorney dated the year of her birth, and inside it, an original hospital discharge summary that Diane had apparently kept, unread by anyone but herself, for 33 years. It listed Eleanor's birth weight, the attending physician's name, and one line Eleanor read 4 times before she understood it: infant B, twin, discharged separately per parental request, placement, Holmes County, Ohio. Eleanor had never been told she was a twin. She sat on the floor of her dead mother's study for over an hour, not crying exactly, but doing the quieter, harder work of realizing that a fact this large about her own life had been deliberately withheld from her by 2 people who claimed to love her without reservation. She thought about calling someone and realized, with a discomfort she didn't examine closely, that there was no one whose first call this would naturally be, no close friend, no partner, nobody she'd built that kind of access with. It was, in a strange way, the first time her isolation had a cost she could point to and name. She hired a private investigator the following week, not out of sentiment, she told herself, but because she had built her entire career on not tolerating unresolved information. The investigator, a methodical woman named Rita Okafor, took 11 days to locate a birth certificate amendment on file in Holmes County, Ohio, listing an infant named Josephine, born the same date as Eleanor, adopted by Frank and Sue Marsh. Rita's report included a current address, a work history, and, near the bottom of the file, a current employer, Halden Grove Capital, LLC, domestic staff, private residence. Eleanor read that line standing in her own kitchen. Josephine was in the next room, folding laundry, close enough that Eleanor could hear the specific rhythm of her hands moving through the task, a sound she had heard nearly every day for 3 years without ever really listening to it. She set the report down on the counter and walked to the doorway and stood there long enough that Josephine noticed and looked up. "Miss Ford? Everything all right?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She was doing something she almost never allowed herself to do, which was simply look, not at the housekeeper, not at an employee, but at a face, searching it feature by feature the way she hadn't since she was a child, pressing her nose to a mirror trying to find some trace of a family she'd been told not to ask about. The scar above the left eyebrow. The exact same faint asymmetry in the smile that Eleanor had spent years being photographed trying to correct. She had looked at this face nearly every day for 3 years and never once seen it, because she had never once let herself believe there was anyone in the world who shared it. "Sit down," Eleanor said, and her voice came out unsteady in a way Josephine had genuinely never heard from her employer in 3 years. "Please. I need to show you something, and I don't know how to say it first." Josephine sat, more out of concern than obedience, because something in Eleanor's face had gone pale and open in a way that frightened her slightly. Eleanor slid the investigator's report across the counter without a word. Josephine read the first page in silence, and Eleanor watched her go through the same private earthquake she'd gone through alone in her mother's study a month earlier, the stillness, the rereading, the moment where a person's entire understanding of their own history has to make room for a fact too large to file anywhere familiar. "This says I have a sister," Josephine said finally, not looking up. "It says we have each other," Eleanor said. "I didn't know either. I found out 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry it took me this long to tell you. I needed to be sure before I said anything, and I didn't know how to say it at all, honestly. I've never had to say something like this to anyone." What followed was not the instant, tearful reunion either of them might have imagined as children. In the version of this story they never got to have. It was more complicated than that, and more honest. Josephine felt something close to anger arrive first, underneath the shock, not at Eleanor, but at the sheer unfairness of the math of it, that one infant had been given a lake house and a private academy and the other had been given a farmhouse and a stroke to nurse her father through at 20, and that for 3 years the first woman had let the second one iron her clothes without either of them knowing what they actually were to each other. She said some of that out loud, carefully, and Eleanor didn't defend herself against it, because she didn't disagree with any of it. "I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years were fair," Eleanor said. "They weren't. I had no idea, but that doesn't undo it. You've been working in my home for 3 years and I never once asked you a real question about your life. I told myself that was professionalism. I think now it might have just been the same thing my mother did to me, deciding not to look too closely at something because it was easier." Josephine gave notice at the staffing agency 2 weeks later, not out of resentment but because it had become impossible to occupy both roles at once, sister and employee, inside the same set of hours. Eleanor didn't try to talk her out of leaving the position. Instead, she asked Josephine what she'd actually wanted before her father's stroke had rerouted her life, and when Josephine said, quietly, that she'd wanted to finish her nursing degree, Eleanor didn't offer to write a check and solve it that way. She asked Josephine what she needed to make that decision herself, and then helped her build a plan that Josephine controlled, tuition support structured as a loan Josephine insisted on repaying, because she'd spent her whole life being given things by people who then held them over her, and she wasn't willing to let that happen with the one relationship in her life that actually mattered by blood. The two women spent the better part of a year rebuilding something that had never technically been built in the first place, which turned out to be harder than repairing an old relationship, because there was no shared history to return to, only two entirely different childhoods to slowly hand each other, piece by piece, over dinners that started stiff and formal and gradually stopped being either. Eleanor learned that Josephine had spent 4 years cleaning hotel rooms in Columbus and never once complained about it to anyone, because complaining, in the Marsh household, was treated as a kind of ingratitude. Josephine learned that Eleanor had grown up in a house with a lake view and had never once, in 33 years, heard either of her parents say they loved her without qualifying it with an accomplishment. "I used to think I got the better deal," Josephine admitted, nearly a year after the filing cabinet, sitting in Eleanor's kitchen, not as staff now, just as a sister who came over on Sundays. "Rich family, private school, all of it. I used to look at girls like you in magazines and think, that's what I was supposed to have. I used to think the same thing about you," Eleanor said. "Not the money. The part where somebody actually held you when you cried. I don't think I had that until I was 33 and reading a stranger's report about my own birth. They didn't resolve it into a neat lesson about money not mattering, because that would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Eleanor's resources genuinely had opened doors Josephine's hadn't had, and pretending otherwise would have insulted what Josephine had actually survived. What they arrived at instead was quieter and more specific, that they had each been given exactly half of what a person needs, split down the middle in a hospital bed by 2 social workers and a scared teenage mother who never got the chance to fix her own decision, and that the only way to become whole from that wasn't to rank which half was worse, but to finally hand each half back to the other. Eleanor eventually funded a small scholarship, unpublicized, at the hospital where they'd been born, specifically for cases involving sibling separation in adoption, not framed as charity from a CEO, but administered quietly through a foundation with Josephine on the board, because Eleanor understood by then that the version of generosity that actually meant something was the kind that gave someone else real authority, not just money. Josephine finished her nursing degree 2 years later, at 35, and took a position at a Chicago hospital 15 minutes from Eleanor's building, close enough that they had dinner most Sundays, in an apartment Josephine paid for herself, with a lease that had, for the first time in either of their lives, nobody's name on it but her own. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself, because it's shaped exactly like a life that looks, from the outside, entirely full, a corner office, a well-run home, a staff that keeps everything running smoothly. And there's a particular kind of grief that doesn't announce itself either, because it's shaped like ordinary hard work, the kind nobody thinks to ask questions about. Eleanor and Josephine spent 3 years in the same rooms, missing each other in plain sight, not because either of them failed to look, but because neither of them had been given a reason to imagine that the person right in front of them might be the missing half of their own history. Sometimes the family we're searching for isn't far away or hidden behind some dramatic revelation. Sometimes they're folding your laundry, 5 feet away, wearing your same face, waiting for you to finally ask a real question instead of a scheduling one. If this story made you think differently about the people you see every day but never really look at, subscribe so more stories like this reach you. Before you go, tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered something about your own family history that changed how you understood your entire life? We read every comment, and sometimes your stories become the next video. Take a little more time to really see the people around you. You never know what you might be missing. We'll see you in the next one.